welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a question that sounds simple on the surface, but wow, it gets complicated fast. What exactly is corruption?
Yeah, and the trigger for this whole deep dive was, interestingly, a New York Times piece.
Right, a really detailed article looking at what seemed very much like, well, bribe-like moments around the Trump administration and this crypto thing called Trump coin.
But here's the kicker. One of the reporters who wrote the article then went online and basically asked, hold on, is this actually corruption? Which just throws the whole thing wide open.
Absolutely. So that's what this is all about for you today. We're going to unpack all the layers of this fascinating debate. We'll start with the mechanics, how this Trump coin actually works and the kind of access it offers.
And then we'll get into the different ways people define corruption, especially now with recent legal stuff making it trickier.
And connect it all back to the big picture. What this means for public trust, for our democratic institutions. It's pretty important stuff.
Exactly. Our mission here is really just to help you navigate all this information, not just the what happened, but more importantly, why it matters, how we talk about these things, how it shapes your view of power and influence today.
Okay, let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So this Trump coin, let's start there. What is it? And why all the fuss?
Okay, so fundamentally, it's described as a valueless meme coin issued by Donald Trump. The controversial part, it's the incentive tied to it.
Which is?
The biggest holders of the coin at a specific cutoff point get an exclusive invite to dinner with Donald J. Trump.
An exclusive dinner. And wasn't there a specific name mentioned, someone expected to be there? Justin's son.
That's right. His wallet, or one associated with him, apparently got the tokens and signed up. Even if he doesn't directly own it, the connection is there.
So the core argument, the critique, is that the setup essentially lets people, well, buy their way into a meeting with Trump.
Precisely. To pitch him on things, on various official actions he should take. That's the accusation.
So when you hear about paying potentially millions for that kind of FaceTime, that kind of access, what jumps out at you?
Well, that question takes us right into the thick of the debate, doesn't it? Because, as I said, the New York Times laid it all out in this, pretty damning article.
But then Eric Lipton, one of the authors, goes on Blue Sky and says, hold on, maybe it's not quite corruption yet. He used phrases like potential corruption.
Yeah, or theoretical corruption,
Yeah.
even Schrodinger's corruption, which is evocative. Like, it exists and doesn't exist until you really look at it, legally speaking.
So what's his definition then? What bar does it need to clear for him?
For Lipton, it seems to hinge on a very specific legal standard, an explicit quid pro quo.
Meaning
Meaning you need proof, hard proof of a transfer of value money, the coin, whatever, directly, explicitly, in exchange for an official act by the president.
Okay.
He gave an example, like if Justin's son bought a stake in some company specifically to get Trump to intervene and drop an SEC case against him, if you can't prove that direct swap, that link.
Then it's not necessarily corruption in that strict legal sense.
Exactly. That's the argument.
But wow, the pushback on that is strong, right? From critics, from the hosts of the podcast we looked at for this.
Oh, definitely. Their reaction is basically, are you kidding me?
Yeah. Paying, what, potentially $2 million for exclusive time to lobby the president? That sounds like a pretty explicit quid pro quo already. You're paying for access to influence policy.
That's the counter-argument, clear as day. It highlights this massive gap, doesn't it, between a narrow, maybe prosecutable legal definition and just the broader public understanding of what feels wrong, what looks like undue influence.
And this whole debate isn't happening in a vacuum, is it? There's the Supreme Court context.
Right. The court has recently made it much more challenging to criminally indict a president for certain acts of corruption, including bribery. So you have to ask,
Does that legal tightening inevitably make us, as a society, talk about corruption differently? Do we start defaulting to only the narrowest, hardest to prove definition, because that's the only one that might stick legally?
it's a really important question. Does the legal framework start to redefine the ethical conversation for everyone?
Now, someone listening might say, hang on, rich donors getting special access, dinners. That's not totally new. Think campaign finance, big fundraisers.
True, that point does come up. Access for donations has happened before.
But is this just more of the same, or is something fundamentally shifted here?
Well, the first response to the analysis we saw is, yeah, those older practices, they probably shouldn't happen either. That's not really an excuse.
Fair point.
But beyond that, there is a key difference being pointed out here, mainly around transparency.
Yeah.
Or the lack of it.
Okay, so how is Trump coin different from, say, donating to a super PAC,
Right.
even with all the problems we know exist there.
Well, with traditional campaign finance, even with super PACs and dark money issues, there are still some reporting requirements. You have to report it. There's at least a paper trail, some public visibility, even if it's murky.
Right.
This Trump coin system, though, the argument is it's entering a different stage of optimization for avoiding transparency. Because with crypto wallets, well, no one knows for sure who these wallets belong to.
Yeah.
And the apparent goal seems to be, maybe, to never tell the public who these, say, 25 dinner attendees actually are. Complete anonymity.
So it becomes a way around existing rules, like a foreign government like Qatar can't just dump $400 million into a super PAC legally.
Exactly. But could a member of their royal family personally buy a bunch of Trump coin and get a seat at that dinner to make their case? This system potentially allows that.
Or Justin's son, who might face limits on direct campaign contributions.
He could potentially use this token route instead. It's fascinating in a disturbing way. It seems to create this additional, more corrupt system on top of the existing one.
A system that specifically enables foreign influence, maybe, in ways that were harder before.
That seems to be the concern. It's sort of.
Mm-hmm.
It closes the window. The argument goes, it's hard to judge corruption in authoritarian states precisely because there's no window in. You can't see who's influencing whom.
And the worry is we're building our own version of that opacity.
That's the fear being expressed, yeah. Moving towards less transparency, not more.
Which really brings us to those broader implications. This gap we talked about between what might get you prosecuted versus what just feels corrupt, ethically speaking.
Mm-hmm.
How damaging is that gap for, like, public trust?
Oh, it's huge, critically important. There's a real difference between what lawyers need to prove in court and the wider sense of, is someone using their office for personal gain, even if you can't pinpoint the exact official act traded for cash?
Yeah.
And if that gap widens, if people see things that look corrupt but are told, oh, it's not technically illegal, it erodes trust. The source material compared it to twisting the one-way ratchet, meaning like deregulation. Once you erode that public trust, once open corruption seems normalized or unpunishable, it's incredibly hard to wind it back. Yeah. To convince people that, honesty and integrity are still possible or valued in public life.
The historical comparisons drawn in the analysis were pretty striking. They weren't holding back.
No, they weren't. Saying things like, we're getting past Nixon, moving into territory well past Nixon.
Yeah, comparing recent events to stuff like the Saturday Night Massacre from Watergate, or even the Valentine's Day Massacre from Gangland history. Just trying to convey the scale, I suppose.
Right. They brought up the Harding administration, too, Teapot Dome scandal.
And argued that some of the alleged Trump actions just flew past this in terms of scale, maybe even ineptitude sometimes. The sheer audacity, like a president just saying a national resource is mine.
Or the idea of taking, what was it, a $400 million gift when leaving office? These were the kinds of examples used to illustrate the perceived shift.
And there was this parallel drawn to Russia's post-Soviet transition.
Yeah, from a state-controlled economy to what they described as an oligarchical, kleptocratic system, almost a mob state.
And the suggestion was that this is kind of the model, that some around Trump envision something similar.
That seemed to be the interpretation in the source, yes.
Yeah.
This idea of actively transferring power away from the democratic control of the state and concentrating it in the hands of a smaller number of oligarchs who then basically run things for their benefit.
Which loops back, finally, to the media's role in reporting all this. Because the New York Times, despite that damning article, got critique for being too cautious, didn't it?
It did, for what was called its defensive shielding. Pulling punches out of fear of legal trouble, even though there's this huge institution with presumably great lawyers and massive resources.
And they had contrasted the Times with Wired magazine.
Right, which apparently did explicitly use the term quid pro quo in their reporting on similar topics.
Right.
Raising the question, if Wired can say it, why couldn't the Times?
And the explanation offered was this idea of the New York Times house style.
Yeah, this tendency, maybe driven by legal caution, to sort of bury the lead or put the really critical, punchy details way down in like paragraph 20.
Out of fear of libel suits, defamation, especially given the Trump administration's open hostility towards the press and threats to challenge libel laws, like the Sullivan ruling.
Exactly. That landmark Sullivan ruling protects journalists, makes it harder for public figures to sue them successfully. If that's under threat, it understandably makes newsrooms nervous.
But the question posed then is a big one. If the New York Times, which, according to the source, employs something like almost 10% of journalists in the United States, if they feel they can't fully speak truth to power,
Then who will? It creates this potential silencing effect, right? If the biggest player is cautious, smaller outlets might feel even more intimidated.
allowing potentially open corruption to just continue without the kind of scrutiny it needs.
That's the deep concern expressed. If the Times is too scared, the source basically says that should worry all of us a lot.
So, okay, we've really dug into the specifics of Trump coin. We've explored this really knotty debate around defining corruption legally versus ethically, and we've touched on the massive implications for our institutions, for public trust, and the media's crucial role.
And hopefully it's clearer how these seemingly abstract arguments really do affect you,
Yeah.
affect your ability to stay informed, and how trust can just kind of evaporate even when things are happening out in the open.
Yeah, the sources we looked at really hammered this point. There still needs to be a belief in some amount of reality, or the value of truth, basic things like that, if there's going to be any way out of this kind of situation.
And they leave us with a pretty sharp question to ponder. If it is never disclosed who goes to this dinner, these exclusive high-stakes dinners,
Mm.
what does that actually mean for accountability, for knowing who is trying to influence power?
So maybe the final thought for you listening is this. In a time where information can feel increasingly murky, deliberately obscured sometimes, what's your responsibility? How do you seek out clarity? And maybe most importantly, how do you decide for yourself what constitutes truth in all this noise?